Hello, my name is Sophie, and during this presentation I will be going through how best to manage ponds and pondscapes in the UK sustainably. To this I will introduce what ponds are, the species within them, the threats to ponds, how to measure health and diversity of ponds, the solutions and mitigations that can be put into place with consideration of stakeholders, and then I'll finally conclude it all into a nice little summary. Ponds are described as a man-made or natural body of standing water between the areas of 1 metre squared to 2 hectares. Throughout the 20th century it was thought that around 50% of all UK ponds were lost, but nowadays there's around 400,000 ponds, with around 80% of them being found in gardens. Additionally, it's thought in the UK that around 80% of all ponds are in poor ecological state. This is particularly worrying because ponds support a wide range of species compared to other freshwater systems. They also support a lot of endangered and scarce species like the great crested newt, many diving beetle species and bat species. There are some animals rely on ponds for the whole of their life cycle, some just for a part of their life cycle like the caddisfly, and others just for food and water. There are 4 main threats facing ponds within the UK, the first being habitat loss and degradation. As I mentioned before, there's been a historical loss of ponds. This is thought to be for a couple of reasons, some of which are still continuing. For instance, many ponds are being drained and then filled up to create space for agriculture and many housing and commercial developments. This is driven by the fact that ponds are seen as unimportant ecologically, and there's not many legal protections in place to protect ponds. Similarly, with habitat degradation, there is a lack of knowledge of how to manage ponds, and with the addition of the other threats that I'm going to go through, it can cause a pond to become poor quality. Invasive non-native species pose a huge threat for much of the wildlife within UK ponds. They are species of animal and or plant that are able to outcompete for resources that native species would be using. This can be like food or space. There are many examples of invasive species, but I'll go for a couple now. The New Zealand pygmyweed. It is a widespread succulent perennial plant, and it can spread very easily, as only a tiny piece can grow to cover an entire pond. It decreases biodiversity and water quality, and it can also reduce the breeding success in great crested newts. Next up, the topmouth gudgeon. It is a non-widespread species that is on alert status, so if you find it, you have to report it. They eat the eggs and larvae of native fish, as well as spreading disease and non-native parasites. This, of course, causes devastating effects on the native fish species. As climate change continues to occur, extreme weather events like droughts are going to become more common. Species that aren't able to survive in temporary ponds that only have water for a couple months of the year are then likely to become locally extinct. Temporary ponds usually are only inhabited by species that can survive in damp mud, like the button ram's horn, species that have a fast life cycle and change into terrestrial or aerial stage, or species that have eggs that can survive in dry conditions, like the daphnia, also known as the water flea. This local extinction of drought-intolerant species create a uniform community, overall reducing the biodiversity of the pond. Pollution is deemed as one of the most prevalent threats to UK ponds. There are 2 main sources of this, and that is agriculture and roads, both of which enter ponds through runoff when there is heavy rainfall. Agricultural pollution includes things like fertilizers and pesticides, both of which reduce biodiversity. Fertilizers, for example, increase the amount of nutrients in the water like nitrogen and phosphorus, causing an increased growth in algae, which then causes algal blooms, which reduces water quality and oxygen concentrations in the water, therefore reduces biodiversity. Road runoff, more common in urban areas, includes things like heavy metals, oils, chlorine, road salts, and other nutrients, all of which are quite toxic to many different species. For example, road salts are known to negatively affect different species' growth and reproductive rates. However, some of these urban ponds are made in order to try and collect all of the pollution to reduce the environmental risk to other water bodies. They are known as stormwater retention ponds. However, there is a sort of paradox to this, because often the ponds that would technically be a more diverse water system are protecting water systems that are potentially less diverse than the ponds would actually be. There are many ways to measure a pond's health and diversity, so I'll be going through a couple of methods, their pros and cons, and what information they can provide. One way of determining pond health is by using the BMWP score, a method in which involves sampling for invertebrates using a pond net, as can be seen in the video. The invertebrate families are then observed and noted down, with each invertebrate family having a corresponding score. A score of 1 shows that the family has a tolerance to pollution, whereas the highest score of 10 shows that the family has an intolerance to pollution. The table on the right now shows an example from Aponda Brachynos campus and the breakdown of the different scores that each family had and the total BMWP score. The BMWP score gives an indication of the water quality, with a higher score meaning that it's a higher quality. The average score per taxon can also be calculated, and that shows how good the water quality is as well. This method also is good because it doesn't require a license to do unless there's great crescent newts within the pond. However, this method does require equipment, and it can be difficult to ID some of the species if you're a novice. Great crescent newt surveys can also be done to determine a pond's health and diversity. Usually, a habitat suitability index is done first. It takes into consideration factors of the pond like location in the shaded area to determine whether it's a suitable habitat for GCNs. However, the score itself doesn't mean that GCNs are present or not, but it gives a useful guide, especially since it doesn't require a license. Egg searching can also be done, which does require a license. It involves searching for eggs on vegetation or on newt strips, like in the image on the right. Bottle trapping is another method that can be done. It also requires a license. It involves placing plastic bottle traps in ponds during the evening, where they are then collected in the morning, where there'll be newts that have accidentally swum into them. The newts are then recorded and then released. This method is more invasive, but it's more effective at detecting populations of GCNs, especially in ponds that are murky. Most of the threats I stated before are large-scale problems that can't necessarily be fixed quickly. There are, however, some things that can be put in place to hopefully offset the bad and promote a healthier pond. But first, there are many different stakeholders that may be involved in ponds and pondscapes that might influence the mitigations and solutions that they want. These include local authorities and national authorities, farmers, landowners, conservation charities, and the general public. I've identified 3 different ecosystem services that ponds may provide people. Biodiversity, which is appealing to many different stakeholders. For recreational purposes, like a duck pond, is appealing to the public and local authorities, and maybe landowners as a feature of their property to make it more appealing. Pollution control is desirable by national authorities and conservation charities, although the two may manage it differently. Some may not even want ponds. As I go through the next mitigations and solutions, I will link to what stakeholders they are more appealing to, and also what solutions can be compromised to minimize conflict between them. Pond management is essential in mitigating many of the problems that ponds face. There are several different methods and techniques that can be done depending on how the person wants to manage their pond. For example, stopping the spread and controlling invasive species within the pond is essential for many, as it helps with the pond's health, but I'll touch on that more later. Doing things like adding newt strips can help increase the population of newts, as it allows for newts to lay eggs in ponds, especially for those with reduced vegetation. Also, creating more ponds and pondscapes around already existing ponds can help build connectivity, but I'll also touch on that later as well. It is also important to continue to measure the health and diversity of ponds to make sure that you know that your pond is continuing to stay healthy or improving. With public ponds, there's the added opportunity to get volunteers involved, and they'll be involved in their community whilst also being informed about ponds, which is very useful for everyone involved. Additionally, making sure that people with private ponds or garden ponds are kept informed, or at least given available information that's useful to them. When it comes to mitigating and solving invasive species problems, the prevention is better than the control. Many invasive species are actually found in garden ponds, so things like the Plant-Wise campaign can be very useful for people with garden ponds as it goes through the native species that they could be using. Also, simple things like cleaning pond equipment between ponds can stop the spread of things. If you've already got invasive species, there's a number of things you can do, but it depends on the invasive you've got. For example, with the New Zealand pygmyweed from before, there are chemical things that can be done, but dredging is the recommended method of getting rid of it, or at least controlling it. There's also some newer research to suggest that this can help control the spread of New Zealand pygmyweed, which might be more attractive to conservation charities. Creating more ponds can help with a number of different things. For example, garden ponds, it can show people that no matter the size of a pond, it can support a wide range of wildlife, while also allowing for connectivity between many different ponds within the UK. Also, pondscapes allow for connectivity between ponds, but also other freshwater systems. There's also the potential for pondscapes to be used as an overall pollution control, as you can have ponds closer to areas of pollution like agricultural land or roads taking the brunt of the pollution, whereas the ponds that are further out can help support biodiversity and wildlife. This is a sort of compromise between the people that want pollution control and those that want biodiversity. There's also the potential to resurrect ghost ponds, which aren't as scary as they sound. They're just ponds that have been filled in. Usually when you restore a ghost pond, it allows for a pond to be created quickly that is usually high quality, as the sediment of the pond usually contains seeds from old plant species that may be rare or locally extinct. This is especially appealing for farmers, as it's a quick way and relatively cheap way of making a pond that can hopefully support pollinators. Ponds are an often overlooked water system despite the range of wildlife that they can support. They face many different threats, with pollution being one of the most prevalent. Doing things like the BMW Peace Score can help determine the health of a pond. From there, mitigations and solutions can be put into place. However, different stakeholders might have different opinions on what should be done. There are compromises that can be made. For example, with pondscapes, some of the ponds could be used for more pollution control, whereas some of them can be used for more biodiversity promotion. Also, doing things like informing people about their own garden ponds can help with the overall health of ponds and pondscapes around the UK. The next few slides are all the references I use throughout. Be sure to pause if you want to look at them in more depth. I hope you enjoyed watching. Bye bye for now.